Mountains can often be a very dramatic part of a landscape painting, so we're going to learn how to paint them digitally. Remember that when you're painting, they're not going to look super realistic. We're doing sort of a more painterly effect here, so they're going to look more like this. So the first thing you need to do is make sure that you have your sky in. I've just used a gradient to get something down. And we've got to put the shape of our mountains in first. I'd recommend using a selection tool for this, the marquee tool, because it gives you a nice sort of uneven line. You could paint it in manually, but filling it in is a little easier, I think. I would select your sky color, the dark sky color, and then move down towards desaturated black. So you're kind of moving diagonally down towards the black. You want something dark, but not super dark. You can always adjust it later. And just fill inside your selection there. You can then make a few other peaks and fill those in too. Remember that the shape of mountains is more like a wave than a pyramid, and it doesn't hurt to look at some reference pictures to get an idea of what mountains actually look like if you're not used to thinking about their shape. So once you've got all of those filled in, we're going to switch to the eraser tool with a very soft-edged brush and a low opacity. And we're just going to soften up the bottom of the mountains so that they don't have a hard visible edge there. We're going to soften them up so it looks like they're sort of disappearing into mist. Now there are actually two different kinds of mountains that you can create. There are what I call simple mountains and complex mountains. Simple mountains are ones that are really, really faded in the distance. Either it's very misty or they're very far away like this. You get a lot of atmospheric perspective, so you can't really see any texture or details on them. Making those kinds of mountains is actually pretty easy. We're going to duplicate your sky layer and move that above the mountains, turn it into a clipping mask, and then just adjust the opacity. The more transparent that layer is, the closer and more detailed the mountains look. If you put it at, say, an 80 or 90% opacity, the mountains fade into the distance so that you can barely see them. So it's a very easy and effective way to make those sort of faded out, distant mountains. Another thing that helps the illusion of the mountains being far away is to blur the edges. So I'm going to make a duplicate of that layer first, because we're going to use that again. And then we're just going to go to the blur tool and just kind of blur the edges a little bit of the mountains, maybe blur the bottoms a bit, and that just makes them look a little bit more like they're farther away. The layer that we copied, I'm actually going to use as a closer range of mountains. It's probably better to draw one from scratch again, but this will save me a little bit of time. So this is our closer mountains. I'm just going to resize them, make them a little bigger because they're closer, and move them down so we can see the originals. In fact, I think I'm going to flip this horizontally. So if you make a selection, free transform, and go to flip horizontal, that will make it less obvious that they are the same mountain. So this is going to be the base color of our closer mountains. And onto this we're going to put some highlights and shadows. So this becomes very much like the painting we did before. We're going to create a clipping mask, and we're going to start with the highlights. Now before we can highlight something, we need to know what direction our light is coming from. Oh, you can of course go to the base layer and erase the edges. As long as you use a hard-edged 100% opacity eraser, you can adjust the shape of your mountains if you like. So this is going to be our highlight layer, and I'm going to have the light coming in from the left, the top left corner. You need to know where your light's coming from so that you can have everything in your painting be consistent. Now to pick your highlight color, you're going to sample your lightest sky color and then move diagonally towards pure white. Not all the way to pure white, but just diagonally towards that to get a lighter version. Now you've got to do a little bit of experimenting because you want to find a brush that's going to kind of scatter and create this rough textured look. So I've experimented with a few brushes here. You can try the ones that I did, or you can experiment with other ones. There might be ones that are even better. I tried one or two until I actually tried more than that isn't in the video, but I tried about 5 or 6 total before I found ones that were good. But then you're going to, with a low opacity, fairly low, maybe 40% brush, you're going to sort of paint over the sides of the mountains that are being hit by the light, the ones that are on the left-hand side in my version. As you do this, you've got to decide which mountains go in front of other mountains. And you want the middle of the mountain to be sort of a jagged edge, not a straight line. This is something that will make them look much more realistic. You don't want them to look like this. You want them to look more like this. And if it helps to kind of draw in a little jagged edge, then feel free to do that.
Now, the reason I'm using a scattered brush is because I want some of the base color to show through. So you have to be careful about how many times you paint over the same area. The more you paint over it, the more it becomes a solid color, and that ruins the illusion of texture. You want a very rough, scattered, contrasty effect where there's lots of lights and darks. So I've switched to another rough brush here because you don't want all of your strokes to have the same texture either. So mixing up brush size and brush types will help create that rough texture. And while you're experimenting with different kinds of brushes, always put them on a layer above the layer that you've just finished. That way, if you don't like the results, it's really easy to just delete the entire layer. So now with a different brush, I'm going in with a brighter color, almost white, and painting over top to add another layer of highlights on top of what we've already done. This is helping to create a greater range of value on the highlight side of the mountain, which makes it look a lot more interesting and gives the imagination more to work with. In this kind of painterly style, you tend to leave a lot more to the imagination, and when people look at your sort of random texture, they'll turn it into something that looks like a mountain. If you find the highlight side getting too solid because you've gone over it too many times, just sample your darks and paint a few of those back in. Now for the shadow side, you're going to sample your dark sky color and then move diagonally towards desaturated black. Not too far. You want it to still be much brighter than your base color. So just like the highlight side, we want to follow the direction of the mountain, so flow down the opposite side. It's okay to leave more of the dark base color showing on this side. You'll probably find when you're doing this that you're going to feel like it just looks like a mess. It's good to scroll back every so often because that will help you get a better sense of how it really does look like 3D shapes. They really do look like mountains. So I took a moment just to flatten my distant mountains. That's another thing about landscapes. The further away things are, the flatter they tend to be. And then you can also use the same sky trick on the foreground mountains. So you can copy your sky, place it on a layer in front, and adjust the opacity. And again, that will determine how much haze, how much atmosphere the viewer seems to be looking through. The more opaque the layer, the further away the mountains will look. And you could continue doing this for layer after layer after layer. I've seen paintings that are just layers of mountains and that's it. And your mountains don't have to have snow on them either. You can always use an adjustment layer and make it look like they're being hit by a sunset or that they're actually just bare rock. You can do all kinds of adjustments once they're created until you decide that you like them. So that's pretty much it for mountains. You can go ahead now and add mountains to your scene.